This week on Perspective, fleeing horror. The Rohingya crisis in Myanmar. The story is sadly familiar. An exodus of terrified people, fleeing violent persecution. But this is a torrent on a scale rarely seen. By UN estimates, more than 500,000 Rohingyas have fled the brutality of the Myanmar military crackdown in just the past 6 weeks, pouring across the border into Bangladesh. What they left behind evokes terrible images, massacres, and mass arson of entire villages, according to evidence collected by human rights groups. Systematic, violent torture and rape. Accounts of children dismembered. People burned alive. And this in a country whose civilian leader was once a symbol for the struggle for democratic values and human rights.
It's a tremendous pleasure to welcome honorary Canadian citizen Aung San Suu Kyi here to Canada.
Aung San Suu Kyi spent 15 years under house arrest in Myanmar and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for her courage. She now leads a country where the military, which ruled the country for nearly half a century, still maintains a firm grip on the levers of power. The Rohingya have long been persecuted in Myanmar, or Burma, as it's also known, but the scale and horror of this has brought the world's condemnation.
Based on reports from the region, this is ethnic cleansing, and it is important for Canada to condemn it in the strongest possible terms and to act. And it is important particularly to call on the military leadership to cease this horror.
There has been no condemnation from the once iconic symbol of human rights. Rather, Suu Kyi has downplayed the crisis.
I understand that many of our friends throughout the world are concerned by reports of villages being burned and of hordes of refugees fleeing. We too are concerned. We want to find out what the real problems are. There have been allegations and counter-allegations, and we have to listen to all of them. And we have to make sure that these allegations are based on solid evidence before we take action.
On the program today, we'll hear firsthand from a man who's lost dozens of family members. We'll speak with a journalist and a human rights activist who've witnessed this story on the ground in Myanmar and in Bangladesh. And we'll get perspective from a respected scholar. But we begin in Yangon, the capital of Myanmar, with journalist Poppy McPherson. She writes for several publications, including Time magazine and The Guardian. Poppy, I know you've spent time in some of those camps in Bangladesh. Tell us what you saw.
Sure. So I was there a couple of weeks ago. I was also there before the crisis happened. So I was only there a couple of weeks actually before the crisis happened. So I saw the situation before and then the situation now. It's just a huge amounts of people, complete chaos really was what I saw when I was there recently. People absolutely desperate for help, with very little idea where they can go, what they can do, who's providing food and water. Many of them had been traveling for days and underwent extremely traumatic experiences. And they arrived, in shock and struggling really to adjust or get situated in Bangladesh, a country where many people, had never lived their entire lives in Myanmar. They didn't necessarily have relatives or friends in Bangladesh already. So it's really a chaotic situation there that appears to be getting worse. There's now, talk of disease spreading, an extremely serious humanitarian crisis.
Tell me a bit about some of the stories people told you about what happened when they left.
Sure. The testimonies were fairly consistent. I heard a lot about people, their villages being surrounded by military and local Rakhine Buddhists, they said. They would say that the soldiers or people would come in firing guns and then people would start to leave and then they'd burn the villages. Basically ensuring that people couldn't go back to the villages where they'd come from. There was also discussion of people brought up stories of people being cut and shot indiscriminately by security forces and Rakhine Buddhists.
You're talking to us now from Yangon. How much of this story is being told there?
Here, it's a very different environment to the international media. The media here is very much focusing on the other communities that have been affected, so the non-Rohingya communities. The Buddhist communities, thousands of Buddhists were displaced, and also the Hindu community. At the moment, there's just this past week, there's been the discovery of a mass grave of people the government says are Hindus who were slaughtered by Rohingya militants. So Rohingya militants actually kicked off this crisis by attacking police posts, which prompted this huge crackdown. So the government is very much focused on the narrative that these problems are caused by Rohingya themselves, the militants, and so the story of refugees isn't really being told here, especially not in local media, not in government media, not on the TV. There's an overwhelming support for Aung San Suu Kyi and her government and their line on this.
How would you describe the relationship between Aung San Suu Kyi and the military? Because, of course, internationally there's a focus on the refugees, but also on the political leadership in the country, too.
Right. It's, from what I hear, it's a tense relationship. You know, obviously, she was under house arrest by the military for so many years. She also regularly speaks about the deep respect that she regularly spoke about the deep respect she has for the military as an institution. She is walking, you know, this line. There's a real fear among some people, whether or not it's merited or not, that the military could use this situation to retake power in the worst circumstances, or just keep this area under their control.
Do you think that's a real possibility?
It's unclear, really. Certainly, the military is harnessing this for their advantage. They, you know, simple things like on their Facebook pages, they promote posts that are in their interest. They're supporting the narrative that they're pushing about this. It's become it's united it's united the people, the NLD, the opposition party, Aung San Suu Kyi, behind the military, really. It's the military is playing the lead, taking the lead role in this crisis. And there aren't really any vocal dissenting voices within the country, or the ones that are, you know, being absolutely harassed online.
Given that, what influence do you think the international community might have here in terms of either helping Myanmar sort of find a solution to this, or actually helping the Rohingya refugees?
Right, it's difficult to say. I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi has repeated over and over again the promise that, you know, the invitation for the international community to be involved here, to come in. The UN staff and diplomats were supposed to go on a visit to some of the affected areas yesterday, and that trip was cancelled due to bad weather. Apparently, it's going to go ahead on Monday, but the government doesn't have a very strong record of listening to the international community on this. I mean, over the past 4 weeks, they've said that they don't know why people are fleeing Rakhine State, which says a lot about where Aung San Suu Kyi, this is what Aung San Suu Kyi herself said, is actually getting her information about what is actually going on. Does she own a TV? Is she really hearing these stories? Otherwise, it's very bizarre how she could come out and say something like that.
Poppy, thank you very much for your insight on this.
No, thank you for having me.